Hello everybody, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools and welcome to the session this afternoon, at least this afternoon in the UK. I'm going to be presenting managing permissions and security for SharePoint with a view to understanding human resource or HR responsibilities with SharePoint and the sort of things that you would really need to know as far as SharePoint and permissions are concerned. So first of all, I'm just going to introduce myself, and as I mentioned, my name is Brett Lonsdale. I'm based around about 10 miles away from Combined Knowledge. We're just due south of Combined Knowledge in Northamptonshire. We're based in a little office which is on a farm, so surrounded by sheep and things like that this time of year, and it's always fun when it snows. My experience of SharePoint goes back to around about 2003 when myself and actually Steve Smith, the founder of Combined Knowledge, worked together for many years as instructors. We used to deliver training courses such as NT and C# and things like that back in the day. And we co-founded Combined Knowledge back in 2003, and I was if you like, the instructor that used to teach all of the developer classes. So since 2007, I decided to get my hands dirty rather than be teaching, and formed a company called Lightning Tools. And Lightning Tools is an organization that provides products for Microsoft SharePoint and also SharePoint Online, and that's what we've been doing for the past 10 years now. As far as the community is concerned, Steve and I again are sort of collaboratively organising a series of events in the UK called UK Community Day. So you can always go to ukcommunityday.com and have a look at any upcoming events. There aren't any yet, but there will be one scheduled very, very shortly. So we've done some events around SharePoint administration, SharePoint development, and Office 365 end user and things like that. They're free to attend, and what makes this different from a lot of different events that you may have attended before, such as user groups and so on, is you can actually bring your own hardware along and get involved in doing some exercises and what have you. So you actually get some hands-on at building things if it's a developer class, or configuring, clicking radio buttons if it's an administration class. If you want to find more information on us, then by all means go to www.lightningtools.com, and also you can follow us on Twitter as well. The Twitter handle is @lightningtools. And that's it really. So that's me. So as far as what we're covering today, I want to first of all focus on why would SharePoint security, SharePoint permissions have any form of impact whatsoever on human resources. Why do human resource managers need to have an understanding of SharePoint permissions? Well, it might be that you're not specifically going in and managing permissions inside Microsoft SharePoint, but it would be certainly helpful for you to understand the involvement that IT have when it comes to managing permissions for people joining the company and also people exiting the company as well, and also changing roles for that matter within inside the organization. And I think the better understanding that you have as to what goes on with the user management or permissions management in SharePoint, the better that makes your roles as well. So one of the things that I think is very important is as a human resource manager or somebody that works with inside the human resources department, you certainly need to have a good close relationship with nearly all of the department heads with inside an organization, but certainly as far as this is concerned, at least with IT. Because one of the things that IT obviously do with regards to SharePoint is to first of all make sure that the right people are accessing the right content in SharePoint. They have access to the correct team sites. They make sure that lists and libraries are shared accordingly, and so on. But a lot of the things that we take for granted as maybe end users are actually extremely difficult for even IT to perform when it comes to Microsoft SharePoint. At least without some form of tool to help them out, because out of the box the SharePoint permissions management is pretty weak. So HR, some of the things that you want to be working with IT on are ensuring that company security policies are upheld inside the organization. Also, access to the company data, access to the content inside SharePoint is removed upon the termination of an employee. If somebody leaves the organization, we want to make sure that all of their permissions are removed. What often happens in that regard is the fact that the Active Directory account for that user that's left the organization is simply disabled. And anybody in IT would know that person's now unable to authenticate. They're not going to be able to authenticate with SharePoint, and therefore, since they can't authenticate, they're not going to be able to access any content within SharePoint. However, that is extremely disconcerting and misleading for other people inside the organization. Let's just take, for example, let's take a user called Fred and say that Fred left the organization 2 years ago, but when Zoe or Kirsten go and navigate to the team site, they keep on seeing Fred as a member of the SharePoint group, or maybe having some direct permissions to some of the content that they created, and that's going to be concerning to them. They may speak to IT and say, well, Fred still has permissions to this content, how come he left 2 years ago? And IT is going to turn around and say, well, don't worry about it, he can't authenticate. Well, that's all very well and good, but you know, the employees are seeing it in black and white that Fred has maybe contribute permissions or even full control for that matter to the content, and you know, they may choose not to believe IT in that instance. So it goes beyond just simply disabling an account, and unfortunately this is something that I see in nearly every day or every week. Is one of the problems that IT is faced with is removing permissions from users when a user leaves the organization. The reason why it's a problem is because it's just such an overwhelming task to perform. If you consider all of the content that may appear in SharePoint, there's sites upon sites. You may have thousands of sites depending on the size of your organization, and those thousands of sites times by maybe 7 or 8 lists per site, times by maybe thousands of documents per library. You know, we're talking a lot of content, and it's not very easy to understand where permission inheritance has been broken on some of those different lists or libraries or at folder or document level. So the task of going through and checking the permissions page on each and every one of these documents or lists and libraries, or even sites for that matter, is pretty much an impossible task. So that's why IT will quite often just simply disable an account, and that's it, they can't authenticate. As time goes on, that may lead to dead accounts as well. Something referred to as a dead account is when maybe the Active Directory user account gets deleted rather than just disabled, but permissions are still assigned to that user inside of SharePoint. It's basically become an orphaned account, and that user that did get deleted from the Active Directory may have actually been, you know, the creator of a document. They may have been the only person that had permissions to a document, or they might be the one and only site collection admin, and so on. So these are some of the issues that occur. So besides users leaving an organization, we've also got new employees that are starting. So that's one issue that kind of leads on to another one. What happens when a new person does join your organization? Well, first of all, we need to determine what level of permissions they need to what content inside of SharePoint. And you know, we might do that on roles or whatever. But SharePoint is kind of designed to allow site owners and site collection administrators to manage permissions, and that makes sense. If we just take, for example, a team site that's been created for our salespeople, so they can manage their sales contacts, their sales tasks, they can put invoices or quotations or whatever salespeople do inside the lists and libraries inside a sales team site. What happens when somebody joins the company? We need to obviously make sure that they are given the right level of permission to all of these invoices, all of these quotations, and so on. Now, we all know salespeople. Salespeople get very, very vicious when it comes to other people maybe reading or commenting on their customers, because it's their customer, not the company's customer. So when it comes to things like invoices and quotations and so on, fights start to happen, and we obviously therefore need to make sure that we are controlling the permissions on who can see that content. Now, IT is not going to know who deals with what accounts and who doesn't. We don't know which customers belong to which salesperson. So quite often that is therefore offloaded for the salespeople to manage. So we might decide that there's a SharePoint champion, maybe that's a sales administrator or a sales manager, whoever is going to be the owner of that team site. And part of being an owner of that team site comes the responsibility of assigning permissions. So somebody that works in the sales department would know exactly what permissions Zoe should have to certain documents, what permissions should Matt have to certain documents, and so on. So they control the permissions management, and this leads on to some other issues, such as the reporting is not very effective in SharePoint out of the box. So it's very difficult to see who has permissions to said content, and it's also an issue from SharePoint 2013 onwards, and also Office 365 SharePoint Online, the fact that we have this new share option. So if you're a Facebook user or any other social media tool user, you'll have come across the fact that you can share things. So somebody posts a funny joke, you want all of your friends to laugh at that funny joke, so therefore you can click on to share, and all of your friends will see the funny joke. Well, that doesn't necessarily work exactly like that inside of SharePoint. We can click on to share at the site level, we can click on to share at list or library level, or we can click on to share at document level as well. Now, one of the goals for document level is to not break permission inheritance unless we really need to. And unfortunately, this new share feature means that when we click share at document level or at folder level, permission inheritance is broken. And that means we've got yet another access control list to manage. So back to that issue when somebody leaves the organization again, if permissions have been shared at document level, that means that that document has unique permissions, and therefore we need to be navigating to document level to make sure that we remove users when they leave the organization, instead of just having one place that we can go to remove permissions. So it's a direct permission that's assigned once we've clicked share, and it's not through the groups and so on, which make things so much easier to manage. What happens if we click share on a site? Well, if we click share on a site, then the user that is the recipient of the new permissions automatically becomes a member of the default group within inside that site. And the default group is the members group, and that members group has edit permissions. And if you take a look at what edit permissions gives you, it gives you the ability to create documents, delete documents, edit documents, and also delete an entire list or library if you want to. So you could remove an entire library of information, an entire document library of invoices, or an entire document library of quotations, because somebody clicked on to share at site level and gave you that permission. So these are the things that we need to be concerned about, and quite often HR are unaware of. So part of the HR responsibility is to make sure that information security policies are adhered to, use case policies are adhered to as well, security policies, and that's very difficult to do with SharePoint out of the box. So you need to be coordinating with IT. IT unfortunately don't necessarily have all the tools that they require to be able to manage the permissions effectively either inside of SharePoint. So they're the problems. So typically Active Directory accounts are simply disabled, as I mentioned. Users are sharing content, which leads to information potentially getting into the wrong hands, and also permissions management being decentralized can be a good thing and a bad thing. IT don't know who should or should not necessarily have permissions, and therefore they need to have the right tools to be able to govern or oversee the permissions management that is going on within inside each department. So terminations, let's just start off with that point. So as I mentioned, lots of people just simply disable the account, but what should actually be happening is the user is removed from the Active Directory groups. So there's different Active Directory groups. Let's just explain those for a moment. So typically every organization has an Active Directory, and there's all of your user accounts are in there, and those user accounts are often organized into security groups, and those security groups can be used to assign permissions inside of SharePoint. Some people like security groups, other people don't, it depends, but there's also something called a SharePoint group as well. So a SharePoint group is something that obviously belongs to just SharePoint. They're scoped to each site collection, and we can use those to assign permissions to people as well. So it really depends. Do you want to add users to Active Directory groups and give permissions to those Active Directory groups throughout SharePoint, or just use SharePoint groups, or a mixture of both? And typically you'll find that there's a mixture of both that goes on inside organizations. So we could take, for example, the sales Active Directory group and nest that into a SharePoint group, and that SharePoint group is then granted permissions. So let's just have a look at that first issue. We've got a very, very simple team site to understand. This doesn't have a lot of permissions assigned to it. It's just enough to be able to explain some concepts. This is running in 2016. The same exact scenario would apply to SharePoint 2013 and also SharePoint Online as well. But first of all, what I'm going to do is just simply go and navigate to the site settings page, and we'll have a look under site permissions as to who's got permissions to this particular team site. So keep in mind again that that was a few clicks to get to this page. If we were inside a document library, we just got a handful of documents here, but you're likely to have thousands of them. And in order to get to that permissions page within inside a document library to look at a document's permissions, is going to take you 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 clicks in order to get to the permissions page to be able to see exactly who's got permissions to that document. And once you're there, it's not that useful. We can see the different SharePoint groups in here. So I've got members, owners, and visitors. I can see what permissions those groups have to the document. And if we click into one of those SharePoint groups, we can see the members of the groups. So here are 3 users that are directly a member of the sales members group, but we've also got this one at the bottom here, which is actually a domain group. And for end users, I say end users, people, department heads, or whoever's managing this particular team site and the permissions, don't get to see who is inside that domain group. We can click onto it, but we don't actually see the members of it. So therein lies a problem. We don't truly know who's got permissions to this particular team site, or sorry, to this particular document in this case. And certainly we're not going to navigate to each and every document one by one to be able to check the this page on them and have to navigate through each of the different SharePoint groups to see who might be a member of it. So that's one of the problems there. We can't see who's inside the Active Directory groups, and for that reason many organizations decide not to use Active Directory groups and they only use SharePoint groups. If you're only using SharePoint groups, that presents problems as well. SharePoint groups are only scoped to a site collection, so you can't use those groups across different site collections in order to assign resources, whereas you can with Active Directory groups. You also can't nest SharePoint groups. We can't take one SharePoint group and make it a member of another SharePoint group in order to assign permissions, whereas we can with Active Directory groups. So there's a couple of issues there. So like I say, sometimes you'll see a mixture of them both, but that means that you can't actually see who's inside the AD groups. So that means either you need to, from IT's perspective, educate your users, make sure that users that do manage permissions are kept up to date with who is a member of an Active Directory group. But that also has issues there as well, because what happens when somebody does leave an organization, again, we tend to disable their account. At best, we might take them out of the Active Directory groups, but our trust is fully in IT's hands as to the users being put inside the correct AD groups. Sometimes users are in the wrong AD group and so on and so forth. So the non-enumeration of AD groups is an issue. What about when we're inside a list or a library as well? So when we're looking at a list or a library, we can see all of this content, and if we want to click onto share, as I mentioned, I could click onto share and share this content with somebody. So let's just take document 5. I'll click onto share, and we'll share this with Kirsten. And one of the problems, if you share something with Kirsten, you know that everybody's going to know about it. So if we share something with Kirsten, I can see on the right-hand side here, this is just really a side note, that it says can edit. So that would imply that Kirsten's going to get edit permissions to this document once I click share. So let's just go ahead and click onto share. We'll just use the default settings there. So I can see in the top right-hand corner that this document has been shared with Kirsten Watson. And let's just have a look at SharePoint out of the box. We'll do those 5 clicks, come down to shared with, click onto advanced. And one of the things I can see from the yellow banner is it says that this document has unique permissions. Prior to that, it was inheriting permissions from its parent, which happened to be the document library. But the issue here is that Kirsten has direct permissions to this. She's not been made a member of a group. She's got direct permissions to the document, and she has contribute permissions. Well, I'm pretty sure when I clicked share, I said can edit, but she doesn't get the edit permission level. She gets contribute as a default. And that is different if you share something at site level. So if we click onto share at site level, so we're just going to simply go through and share this with a user. Let's just pick somebody. We've got Ines Morocco. We'll click share. So again, it's been shared at site level, and if we navigate to the site, have a look at the site permissions, we can see that the user hasn't been granted direct permissions. If we go inside the members group, we can see that the user is now a member of that group. So that happens whenever you click at share at the site level. So the user's made a member of that group. Permission inheritance isn't broken, it just happened to already be broken on this site. So if the site was inheriting permissions, that would have been retained. It would still be inheriting permissions, but this user has been made a member of the members group. Now where that becomes a problem, and something I think HR should be aware of, is just simply somebody clicking share at this level will also affect other groups, other documents, other sites, other documents and other lists and libraries that also make use of that group. So without thinking, if I had a subsite, so if we go to the site contents and create a new subsite, we'll just call that test. And when we create a site, we have the ability to use the same permissions as the parent or have unique permissions. So I'm just going to use the same permissions as the parent. Now the user clicking onto share didn't consider that by making that user a member of the members group is also going to be giving them permissions to other sites as well. So this site could have already been created. It could have confidential information in there. It could have salary information in there or whatever. All the user was concerned with was granting permissions to the sales team site without a concern that that same group is used inside the test site below, which could contain other confidential information. So this is another issue when we're clicking onto share with inside SharePoint. And it has different behaviors depending on whether we do it at site level, whether we do it at list or library level, or also at item level. So that's one of the problems. When share has been clicked at document level, there's all these direct permissions that get created, and that just makes it really, really difficult to remove that user from inside the SharePoint environment. Okay, so that's a problem that I just need you to be aware of at this point in time. So security awareness, when you share information, what can the user I shared the content with do? Well, let's just have a look at that. As I mentioned, the edit permissions is a brand new permission level. It's something that was introduced with SharePoint 2013. If we just go to our top level team site here inside the site collection, and we'll click onto permission levels. These are completely out of the box. I created the site collection today, and this is the new guy we've got called edit. So if you use SharePoint 2010, you won't have an edit permission level, but edit is the default. So when you click onto share at site level, you're going to give somebody the edit permissions. And here's a description of what that user can do. So they can add, edit, and delete lists, can view, add, update, and delete list items, and also documents. So you could innocently, as a sales manager or sales administrator, think, yep, Zoe needs to be able to see this site. I'll click onto share, so it's shared with her, and all of a sudden Zoe has the ability to delete the entire lists and libraries and all of the content along with it, which she may not do deliberately, but even so, she has the ability to do that. Not only can she do it at that site, but she can do it at any site that uses the same members group. So that includes subsites and also potentially sibling sites as well. So that's one of the issues that we're concerned with there. Excuse me. So what if you want to know precisely who has access to the content? Well, one of the things that we can do with inside a site is use the check permissions option. So if we just go to site permissions for a moment, as you can see, we've got some people in here. We can see that we've got the sales domain group, but as I've already illustrated, you can't see who's inside that sales domain group. So what we can do, if we suspect somebody might have permissions, from the permissions page, we can do a check permissions. So we can click onto check permissions, and if I type in Rio here as an example, we can select her, click onto check now, and it shows me what permissions Rio has. So Rio has edit permissions, and it's through the sales members group. Well, the fact that I can't see Rio as being directly a member of this group, she must be inside that domain group there. So that's the only way you can actually tell if somebody is inside a domain group, but that kind of falls flat on its face if you do have multiple domain groups as a entry inside any of the SharePoint groups. Okay, so that's another issue, but we can use the check permissions to be able to see who has access to it. So the things that we need to understand: who's a member of each of our Active Directory groups, who's inside our SharePoint groups, and there's also implicit permissions as well to be concerned with. So people that don't even show up inside the site permissions page could be granted permissions through the fact that they're a site collection administrator. So if we do have a site collection administrator which isn't necessarily a member of the IT department, they will be able to see every piece of content inside the site collection. So something that you might think is private to just a couple of users, you always have to consider that there's also site collection admins or people with user policies as well will be able to see that content as well. So you're not getting the full picture with SharePoint out of the box. New personnel, we need to sometimes do things like cloning permissions. So when we do have a new starter join an organization, it's very difficult in SharePoint to make sure that they are given the correct permissions to the correct content. So we need to add them to SharePoint groups, maybe need to add them to some Active Directory groups, and there might also be some direct permissions that we need to go ahead and assign to those users as well. And what makes this difficult is when somebody changes roles. So if somebody moves from one department to another, gets promoted, gets demoted, whatever it might be, we may need to change their permissions. And in an ideal world, we'll be able to do that in bulk. So if we could take all of the permissions assigned to one user and transfer them to somebody else that's just joined that department, that would be ideal. And SharePoint doesn't provide you with the ability of doing that out of the box, unfortunately. So, so new personnel requires a lot of changes, a lot of understanding of where permissions are granted and so on, and not just a simple case of clicking share with inside the SharePoint sites, because as we've already seen, that can have a big knock-on effect. So alerting to changes, ideally, if we're decentralizing permissions management, we're allowing site owners and site collection admins to be able to manage permissions and report on permissions. It would be useful to be able to oversee exactly what they're doing. So that's one thing I'm going to show you in just a moment, is how our product can help you keep control of who's got permissions by using some alerting features and also notification features as well. So you can see not just who's got permissions at this current point in time, but who granted the permissions and when did they grant them, at what level did they grant them, and so on. So just a quick recap before we go in and have a look at the tool, how the permissions work. So inside the Active Directory, we've got some individual users. In this particular case, we've got Stuart, Bob, Gary, and Kevin. So those are all minions, just in case you didn't guess. But those users, there's so many different ways where they could be granted permissions. So we could put them into SharePoint groups, first of all. So they could be a member directly of members, visitors, or a custom group. And those groups are then granted a permission level such as full control, design, edit, contribute, or read. And each of those permission levels are assigned individual permissions. So they're split into three. We've got the site permissions, list permissions, and also personal permissions, of which there's about 30 different permissions that are all organized into these permission levels, and that's how the users get granted permissions. But the users could also be granted those permissions directly. That's the one thing that we really want to avoid at all costs, because it makes it so difficult to manage. Obviously, if somebody does leave the organization, we can just simply take them out of a SharePoint group if we know what SharePoint groups they're a member of. But if there's all these documents with unique permissions and broken permission inheritance, we need to be able to navigate to each of those individually and take the user out. Also, they could be a member of an Active Directory group. That Active Directory group could be a member of a SharePoint group, or also granted permission levels directly as well. And that's one of the issues, is from SharePoint you can't see who is a member of each of the different Active Directory groups. Okay, so Active Directory we kind of talked about, site collections and where the groups are managed. Let's just take a look at decentralized permissions management. So as I mentioned, this is enabling team members to basically manage the content, team members from each IT department, from each department inside the organization, and really we need to have somebody that can both educate, so provide training on how to manage permissions and how to administer different team sites. That's obviously extremely important, but also IT need to be able to govern and oversee exactly what's going on. Okay, so some of this stuff we've already taken a look at. So what I'm going to show you is how we can help you get a better understanding of these permissions and how they're all assigned and report on them more effectively. So let's just take this sales team site one more time and have a look. If we go to the site settings and site permissions, as you saw, we had a number of different users. So in fact, 4 users there that are a member of the members group, and if we go into the visitors group, there's 1 user here. Now that's going to be probably times 100 or times 1,000, depending on the size of your organization. If we used DeliverPoint, the Lightning Tools product, what we can do is from the Site Actions menu come down and discover the site permissions instead. And what we do is we enumerate every single Active Directory group and also take into consideration the implicit permissions as well. So what you'll see at the top here is Brett. Myself, I have full control, and that's assigned implicitly because I'm a site collection administrator. So there's no mention of me whatsoever when you navigated to the site permissions page using SharePoint out of the box. Also, we have system account, which has full control, and then there's the 4 users that we saw that were a member of the members group. The last user here has read permissions through the visitors group, but we've also got these 3 other users here, Benjamin, Amelia, and Rio all have edit permissions. So they didn't show up in the SharePoint out-of-the-box permissions report, but they show up here, and we can see why over on the right. So where it says permissioned via, we can expand the sales members group, and within that view I can see that Amelia, Benjamin and Rio are all inside that sales domain group. So the sales domain groups get enumerated as well, but more importantly this report shows every single user that has permissions to this particular team site. So you get the full picture here. You can also do things like filter based on permission level. So again, you're probably going to have thousands of permissions or thousands of people permissioned to a team site. What we can do here is just simply go and look at a particular permission level. So if we wanted to see everybody that's got edit permissions, we can do that. If we want to have a look at everybody that's got full control and so on, we can also do that as well. Or maybe we want to see everybody that's been permissioned via a certain Active Directory group. So we can also do that as well, so we can see all of our salespeople and what permissions they have. You can also manage the permissions from here, so it might be that we want to remove one of these users, so we've got the ability to delete the permissions. We can grant additional permissions and things like that. If we were to navigate to a document library, one of the things that we want to be able to tell is which of these documents have unique permissions. So there could again be thousands of them. So if we go to the Deliver Point ribbon instead of using SharePoint out of the box, one of the things we can do is click onto this Unique Items button. And that Unique Items button shows me 2 items that have unique permissions, Folder 2, but also Word Document 5, and that was because I clicked Share a short while ago and shared the permissions with Kirsten. So that could bring back every item that has unique permissions, which saves you tremendous amounts of time being able to report on those. So if we want to have a look at those, what we can do is just simply select them. So I could select Folder 2 and Word Document 5, and from the Deliver Point menu we can now discover the permissions on those 2 items. So that again brings back all of the permissions, and sure enough we can see Kirsten Watson has contribute permissions to the document. If I wanted to have a look at all of Kirsten's permissions across everything that I selected, we could do that. I can simply type in Kirsten and see what permissions she has, and we can see she doesn't have permissions to the folder, but she does have the permissions to Word Document 5, which we gave her. Okay, so that provides the department users, the site owners and the site collection administrators with more control over who's got permissions to the content. Another page that we can navigate to is the main Deliver Point page, and this is really intended for site collection administrators and also IT as well. So what we might want to do, let's just take that employee that's going to leave the organization. We could simply select the entire server farm if we wanted to, or an entire site collection if we're looking at Office 365. So here's the product running in Office 365 on my tenant. So we have the ability to do it in both on-premises and online. And what we can do here is just run a unique permissions report. So first of all, we go to an account-centric view. We'll have a look at a particular user. So if I wanted to have a look at Amelia, let's look at her account. So there she is. We'll select her and we'll click onto unique permissions. So before she leaves the organization, in one report I can see what groups she's a member of, so I know exactly what groups to take her out of. She's in the sales domain group, which we already determined, but she's also in Santa's good list, so we can make sure that she's taken out of that Active Directory group as well. I can see all the different site permissions that she has, as well as the list permissions and also the item permissions, and each of these can be changed. These are all hyperlinks that go directly to the page where I can just simply remove that permission if I want to. But more importantly, if she's going to leave the organization, then I could simply delete all of her permissions, including all of the unique permissions that she's got, in one go. I can just simply click on to delete permissions here, specify the account that I want to remove, and all of her permissions will be removed. That would leave behind the Active Directory groups that she's a member of. But what we're armed with is the AD group, so I can go back to IT and inform them that Amelia needs to be removed from those AD groups. And that's not just going to help SharePoint, but it's going to help other applications that you may be running as well inside your environment. So that can be done in one go. Another thing that we might decide to do is, instead of deleting all of Amelia's permissions, if she is leaving, she's being replaced by somebody else, then we could transfer the permissions. So simply we could do that at farm level as well. We could select that entire farm, go across to transfer permissions at the top here. And so we can choose the user that we want to transfer the permissions from and the user that we want to transfer the permissions to. And one of the things that we could help here with the onboarding process is you can create template accounts. So we might actually have every role inside our organization with the permissions assigned to those roles. So every time we hire a new salesperson, I can simply transfer the permissions from salesperson to the new starter, or from manufacturing to the new starter, and so on. So all of those permissions can be granted to the relevant team sites in one action, as opposed to having to go and figure that out and use the share feature. You could also grant permissions as well via this, and one of the improvements that we've made with our grant permissions is the fact that you can grant permissions for a certain amount of time. So obviously every employee that we have inside our organization is not necessarily a permanent employee. We have temporary staff and so on. And another issue that users face in SharePoint is the fact that they go and share information with that temporary member of staff, but they forget to remove the permissions again afterwards. And maybe they don't even know what permissions they've got anymore because people have been clicking that share button. So what we can do here is, when we go to grant a user permissions, we could grant permissions to Kirsten. I could choose what level of permission I want her to have, and I want her to be able to have design permissions for 1 day, let's say, or a week, or whatever. And after that period of time has elapsed, those permissions will be automatically revoked, so we don't have to worry about going and cleaning those permissions up again in a week's time, or a day's time, whatever it was that we set. So there's granting, there's transferring, deleting. We've also got a dead account report that you can execute, and this dead account report is for anybody that has been disabled or removed from the Active Directory, but still have permissions inside of SharePoint. So this is something we can run web application level or site collection level. It will enumerate all those dead accounts, and then we can clean up. We can remove those permissions from that account that doesn't even exist anymore, and that's going to lead to less confusion amongst the users. So that just really leaves alerting and notifications. So what we can do here is have a look at a particular site collection if we want to, and rather than just seeing who's got permissions now, we can actually go through and audit those permissions. So this is really useful for IT. If we've allowed our users to be able to manage permissions, then we can see what they've been doing. So this is just looking at the past week. And we can see inside this site collection there was just actually one change which we made during this presentation. If we go and have a look at a bigger window, let's go to another site collection where we've got more content. So I'll go to the root site collection here, and we'll audit the permissions on that site collection. And what I'm going to do is just give it a few months to look at. Okay, so this then tells me all of the changes that have occurred. So we can see who the initiator was, the date and the time that the permissions changed, and what did they change on. So we've seen users that have been granted permissions, what permission level they've received. We can see any permission inheritance changes as well, so whether they were broken or re-inherited, and we've also got all the different group membership changes as well. So as people are made members of new groups, all of that information is recorded. So if ever we try and figure out why did Edward Snowden get full control to a site collection, we could always go back and see who gave Edward Snowden full control and blame them. We've also got the ability to set up notifications. So if you are decentralizing your permissions management, one thing we can do is come down here to Alert Me, and we can configure an alert. So we basically set up an alert trigger on any site or site collection inside our environment. We click onto New Alert, and it will start looking at a specific type of change. So what I could do is it might be that I've given Kirsten some abilities to manage permissions inside a site collection, so I just want to keep an eye on what she's doing. So what I can do is just go and set up any alerts for Brett. Oops. So Brett's going to receive the notification, and we can put the title of the email, so Kirsten changed something, and we can monitor any permission change that we like, but we can refine that by permission level, by the change initiator, or by the member. So the member might be a case of we could put Edward Snowden in there as an example. So if Edward Snowden gets permissions to anything, then Brett's notified. Or we can say the permission level was full control. So just tell me if somebody got full control to something. We could be notified on that. But in this case, we can say the change initiator is Kirsten Watson. So we can add her in there, send me a notification immediately, and if we just hit create, that's going to start to monitor that. So as soon as Kirsten changes anything, I get notified about it, and we can go through, maybe track what changes she made and tell her not to do it again. And then besides that, we've just simply got copying entire site permissions, copying list permissions, and copying item permissions. So that allows us to take entire access control lists from one object and assign them to another, which certainly saves a lot of time. So at that point, let's just finish the slide. So we've got the, as I mentioned, the fact that we can go through and check permissions using SharePoint. There's permission inheritance to be concerned with. So when permission inheritance is broken at different sites, or maybe lists or items, we need to be concerned with that, because this is exactly what happens. Let's say we've got our sales team site at the top here. We create a subsite which inherits the permissions, so the same groups are still being used to assign permissions at the sales blog, but we decide to break permission inheritance and create a couple more groups. So we've got sales blog authors, sales blog approvers, but the one thing we didn't take into consideration is the fact that the groups that were inherited are still inherited. So if somebody clicks share at the sales site, makes them a member of the sales members group, they will still also be a member of that sales members group at the sales blog level. So they would still be able to go in and delete an entire library of information at the sales blog level, not just the sales site at the top there. One way of controlling that, by the way, because DeliverPoint reports on permissions, allows you to manage them, but it doesn't stop that from happening. What you can do using SharePoint out of the box is go through and create a new group. So if we went to our groups view here and we created a new group, so we could call this sales contributors or something to that effect. We can set the group owner. We can specify who can change the memberships of the group and that sort of thing. And what I'm going to do is assign it the contribute level, not the edit level, to this particular team site. So we'll go through and create that. So we could then go and add any members that we like to it. So in here we could go and add the sales group or whatever we want to use, or we could add individuals. But also what we can do with inside that under the settings menu is make that the default group. So if we make this new group, sales contributors, the default group, guess what happens when you click share at the site level? So we now click share at the site level. Let's put in a user, Farah. So we'll share that. So it's been shared with Farah, but we'll go and have a look at the site settings, and under site permissions, we can see that he's actually now a member of the contributors group. So no longer can he go through and delete entire lists or libraries of information. He's just going to get contribute permissions, which means he can create content, edit content, and delete content, but not entire lists or libraries, at least not in one go anyway. So so that certainly makes that a lot more controllable. Breaking permission inheritance, we just need to make sure that we don't do that very often unless we really have to. Clicking share at item level will break permission inheritance, but quite often users will break permission inheritance to make a change instead of educating themselves on who's already members of SharePoint groups and Active Directory groups. So even without a third-party tool, you can you gain an understanding as to who's a member of each of the groups, because quite often, because you can't see inside AD groups, it's assumed that users don't have permissions to a particular team site, and therefore they'll just be granted permissions again by breaking the permission inheritance and going granting the user permissions. And that just ends up with you having broken permission inheritance everywhere and duplicated permissions. So educating yourself on who's a member of each of the different groups and liaising with IT will certainly help there. And just really for a written reference, because share is really confusing, so I'll make these slides available after the webinar. I'll make sure that Zoe has them so you'll be able to go and grab them for yourselves. But if you share at site level, then permission inheritance is not broken for the site, so remember that, but they are added to the default group. Folder level and item level permission inheritance is broken and a direct permission is assigned. Okay, and one thing that we can do to limit the number of broken permission inheritance at item level is actually use folders. And I know some users are discouraged from using folders and to use metadata instead, which I'm completely a fan of. But one thing you can do is actually hide the folders as well, so that they appear to be, it doesn't appear that there's any folders, but when users are creating content, they are created within a folder that has permissions assigned to the folder rather than at each item. Okay, managing in bulk. So the only people that really do this is IT, because they can use PowerShell to do it. So if you do have a user leave the organization replaced by somebody else, you could use PowerShell to transfer permissions in bulk. But that's a bit of a pain, and again, it's not always IT that are managing permissions. Sometimes it's site collection administrators. So third-party tools, whether it's DeliverPoint or you go to, there's many other organizations, also other SharePoint vendors that have a permissions management tool. So any tool will make this a lot easier as far as managing permissions are concerned. So some key points from obviously a HR perspective, having a tool like this would give you hopefully the ability to understand that a user has left the organization, their permissions have been removed. It certainly makes it easier with the onboarding process to make sure that people are granted the right level of permission, so we can do things like transfer permissions from one account to another. And it also makes sure that you're not sharing information outside of the organization. That's one of the things we can do with Office 365 is share the user with an external, or share permissions with an external user as well. So you can keep an eye on that using DeliverPoint, and that makes it a lot easier to ensure that your security policies are therefore adhered to and nobody's misusing their ability to use share. So at that point, I'm going to open up for questions. You have got the ability to raise your hand using the GoToWebinar software. So there is a raise your hand option don't manually raise your hand because I won't see that. But if you do click onto raise your hand, you'll be able to ask a question. Or if you don't want to ask a question verbally, you can do so by emailing me on brett@lightningtools.com, or you can also tweet your question as well, and so you'll find me on @BrettLonsdale. It's my Twitter account. So if you found the option, it's in the GoToWebinar software. Just click on raise your hand and then I can unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question. Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands yet. So I guess at that point, I just want to thank everybody for attending the webinar. I hope you found it useful, and don't forget next week's webinar is with Kirsten, so she can get revenge on me by using me as examples, I guess, in her presentation. But make sure that you sign up for that one. It's an excellent presentation that Kirsten's going to give on HR, so yeah, please make sure you register, and besides that, thank you very much everybody for attending.